All right, so getting back to the story of Islam, we're going to take a look at kind of the political history of Islam after Muhammad. Okay, so in 632, Muhammad dies slash ascends, and this new Arabic or Islamic empire is leaderless. And this is a pretty pivotal moment for Islam. Since its beginning and foundation, it has only known one source, and that source has been Muhammad. He is the prophet of God, he is the religious authority, he is the political authority, he is all of these things wrapped in one. His words provide every single piece of how Muslims should live, both religiously, spiritually, politically, socially, culturally. Everything comes from his teachings. So, with him no longer there to guide, the Muslim community looks for an answer in terms of, where do we go from here? Now, after a lot of debate and a very contentious election process, one of Muhammad's very close confidants, a man by the name of Abu Bakr, is elected as the new leader of the Muslim empire, and he becomes known as the Caliph. And this is the beginning of one of three dynasties, I guess you could call it, within the Islamic Empire. This is the beginning of what we call the Rashidun Caliphate. Okay, Rashidun meaning rightly guided. So with Abu Bakr's election as Caliph, this begins sowing the seeds of the first major split within Islam. And it all really kind of boils down to politics. There is one side who favors the election of the caliph by the ulama, which is the educated Muslim aristocracy. And then there's another group who favors that the caliph should come from the house or the bloodline of Muhammad himself. And this political separation is going to really start to pull apart this Islamic empire within a few generations. Now, here's the thing: is even with those political differences, the caliphate begins to expand incredibly rapidly. Under the Rashidun caliphs, the caliphate more than doubles in size. Most of that is through military conquest. Some of it is through, peaceful diffusion along trade routes. But whichever manner it is, and we'll talk more about why Islam sees so many conversions early on. Within the first four caliphs, the Islamic Empire is able to incorporate Egypt, pretty much the entire Middle East, most of Persia, and parts of Central Asia. And this brings tens of millions of converts to Islam. The Dar al Islam, this Islamic caliphate, within 20 years becomes the largest political unit, the largest state on the planet at the time. Okay? Because you got to remember, this is most of the classical empires have collapsed by now. Han China is gone, Rome is long gone, well, at least Western Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire is still around, but the spread of Islam is rapidly, causing it to shrink. Yeah, the Persians are still around, but again, Islam is basically overrunning Persia as well. And what you see is this rather small, politically disjointed group of Arab tribes from this peninsula in the desert all of a sudden becomes an incredibly unified, well-oiled political and military machine. Okay. The nomadic lifestyle of The Arabic people lends itself to them being excellent horse and camel riders, which means that they tend to be very good soldiers. Um, Islam offers, social benefits. It offers economic benefits to people who convert. So there's a lot of different reasons why all of this happens. But the expansion of Islam happens at a rate that is basically unheard of in human history up to this point, right? Now, unfortunately, even with all of that success, these disagreements among the Muslim leadership themselves continue to build and build and build. And three of the four Rashidun caliphs are assassinated or removed from power. And this leads to the first Muslim civil war. And this Muslim civil war is bloody and it is brutal, and it really kind of cements the split within Islam, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But that civil war ends in 656 CE with the victory of Muawiyah the First, and he's going to go on to establish the next dynasty within Islam, which is the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, I want to pause briefly and talk about this major split within Islam. The two sides of this split are known as Sunni and Shia. And like I said, this division within Islam initially begins as a purely political issue. However, over time and over centuries, the two sides begin to practice and worship differently, and they, their interpretations of the Quran and of Islamic teachings begins to vary and separate. But those extra details won't be something that you'll need to know, but you will need to know is where this division originally comes from, right? So on one side, you have the Sunni Muslims, who are the majority of the Ummah. They make about 85% of the Muslim population nowadays. They see the ulama, right? The aristocracy, the educated Muslim aristocracy, um, as the true leadership of the Muslim community. They believe that the caliph should be elected by the ulama from the best candidates, basically choosing whoever is the most capable leader, the person that's going to bring as much prosperity and success to Islam as possible. Um, on the other side, you have Shia Muslims who are, the vast minority today, about 15%. Shia Muslims tend to be led by imams, religious scholars, and teachers. They believe that the caliph should only come from the family and the bloodline of Muhammad, beginning with one person in particular named Ali, who was the great nephew of Muhammad. Um, they believe that the authority comes from Allah and Allah alone, and that the Sunni have deviated from Allah's will in electing more secular leaders and focusing on the expansion of land and wealth and power. Now, getting back to kind of the story of expanding Islam, um, the next dynasty that arises within the Islamic Caliphate is established under a general by the name of Muawiyah the First, and the Umayyad dynasty is a military regime. Their focus is on conquest and extending the boundaries of the caliphate, and they are incredibly successful. They bring Islam to Spain, to North Africa, further into Central Asia, even into northern India. They nearly complete a conquest of Europe. They are defeated at the Battle of Tours by a Germanic tribe known as the Franks, which we will talk about very importantly when we get to post classical Europe. But this battle really is the decisive moment that kind of prevents the spread of Islam into Western Europe, France, Italy, those areas. And very likely, this is something that saves Christianity from maybe not being wiped out, but it saves Christianity from being, just another religion. If Islam were to spread into Western Europe and become the dominant religion there, as it did in almost every other area that it spread to, the power base of Christianity, which at that point was either Constantinople or Rome, would have essentially been wiped out. You would have no Roman Catholic Church. And with no Roman Catholic Church, you know, in the 13 and 1400s, when people from Europe begin making their way across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, instead of, planting the flag of the cross and of Jesus, they would have been bringing, the crescent moon and the star of Islam, which would have massive ramifications. I mean, the majority of people on this continent and the continent directly to our south are Christian. And the reason that they are predominantly Christian is because that religion was brought here and essentially imposed on the land by Europeans. And most of you in here, and most of you listening to this, are probably Christian because of that. And without the Franks stopping the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours, Columbus and those explorers wouldn't have been bringing Christianity. They would have been bringing Islam, which means an overwhelming majority of you listening to this, if not all of you, would probably be Muslim. So, this single battle has, pretty massive ramifications. Um, Now, the Umayyads, they are a military regime. Their focus is on the secular, on the worldly. They are not tied to Mecca. They're not tied to Muhammad and his bloodline. So their loyalty doesn't necessarily lie in Arabia. And so they moved the capital of the Caliphate from Mecca, its religious home, to Damascus, which is a much more worldly, larger, wealthier city, that's more tied in with the trade networks and, the more centralized. And this makes a lot of people very, very angry because in their eyes, the Umayyads are removing the religion from the empire. Okay, they are trying to start to separate church from state, which is not, which is not part of the Islamic identity, and that's going to build up a lot of resentment against them. Another thing that they do that builds up a lot of resentment against them is that Muawiyah, the first in this Umayyad line, makes the title of Caliph into a hereditary title, meaning that it will only pass down through his family. And this upsets Sunnis and Shia because now neither one of them is getting what they want. Um, Now, the Umayyads also make a lot of people angry because they show a very clear favoritism to Arabs, especially to the Arab aristocracy, the wealthy Arabs. And by this point, Islam has expanded into a lot of other regions. And there are a lot of Muslim converts who feel as if this is this goes directly against the idea of the Ummah, the idea that there's this Muslim brotherhood that everyone is equal in terms of, in the eyes of Allah. Two groups in particular, the Persians and the Turks from Central Asia, build up a lot of resentment to this kind of Arab favoritism. And the Umayyads are accused of being too worldly, too secular, too cosmopolitan, too focused on land and power and wealth. And over time, that anger that builds up is going to turn into revolt. And in 750 CE, the Umayyads are overthrown by another family known as the Abbasids, who are going to essentially wipe out the Umayyads and restart the Caliphate kind of all over again. So this map gives you an idea of the expansion of Islam and the Islamic Caliphate up until the end of the Umayyads. And I mean, in terms of world history, guys, this is pretty. I mean, this is pretty impressive. I mean, this is a period of about less than 130 years, and within that 130 years, the Islamic Caliphate, like I said, becomes the largest state that has ever existed in human history up to this point. And it is, only a few sword strokes away at the Battle of Tours from dominating Europe and, what would go on to become, basically the home, the home and the power and the stronghold of Christianity. Um, so the rise of Islam is like nothing that basically anyone's ever seen. Now, with the demise of the Umayyad Caliphate, you have the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, which is established under Abu al-Abbas in 750. And Abbas or al-Abbas and his family are wealthy Sunnis that come from Mecca. So they have a much more religious focus. However, they also want to hold on to power the way that the Umayyads did. So they don't overturn the hereditary title part of being Caliph. And they don't return the status, but they don't return the capital to Mecca. They move the capital from Damascus to the city of Baghdad. And by moving it to Baghdad, which is more central to the Persian homelands, this moves Arabs out of the driver's seat. I mean, Arabs are still the important ethnicity within Islam. They're the founders of it. But Persians begin to have a lot more influence within the empire. You can see this in some of the traditions and the social customs that come under the Abbasids. You can also see it in a lot of the artwork from this time period. And so, with this shift in political power and this shift in priorities, the Abbasids refocus the empire. Military conquest and expansion becomes pushed to the background, and they put the focus of the empire on education, trade, and cultural patronage. Okay, investing money into infrastructure, they invest money in education, they invest money into schools and libraries and things of this nature. But by doing that, they allow the military to weaken. Their control over the caliphate starts to slowly loosen and eventually fall apart. Now, with the capital of the caliphate moving to Baghdad, Baghdad becomes a massively important city. It becomes a major trade center. The Abbasids generate enormous wealth. And like we said, they reinvest that within the empire rather than in expanding the empire. But by ignoring the army, they kind of invite rebellion against themselves. And within only a few decades, many parts of the Islamic Caliphate begin to declare political independence from the Abbasids while still pledging their religious loyalty. Okay, essentially meaning that the Abbasids are the leaders of Islam worldwide, but their political power over those people basically has to give way. So this is where you start to see some fracturing within this idea of the Dar al Islam, where you start to see some fracturing in the unity of the different Muslim groups. Some specific examples: the Moors, which are the main Muslim group in Spain that came from North Africa, declare their independence and create the Emirate of Cordova. The Seljuk Turks in Central Asia declare their independence and form their own state, which is going to actually later on come and invade Baghdad and kind of take over political control away from the Abbasids. The Fatimids, which are a slave army that the Abbasids actually created themselves in Egypt, revolts against the Abbasids and they take control over Egypt. So essentially, what's happening is under the Abbasids, this Islamic Caliphate is now splintering into several different pieces, with everybody pledging support and loyalty to the religious authority of the Abbasids, but basically ignoring them politically. And eventually, the Abbasids are going to become basically just figureheads. By 950 CE, the Seljuk Turks have invaded Persia out of Central Asia and basically taken over the Abbasid caliphate. Um, the Abbasid Caliph still sits on a throne and he is still considered the religious leader, but he has basically no say. Like again, he said he's basically a figurehead. The final blow comes in 1258, thanks to the Mongols. One of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Hulagu Khan, invades the caliphate, captures and burns Baghdad, slaughters somewhere between 1 million to 2 million people, executes the caliphate. And this basically brings an end not only to the Abbasids, but to Arab domination over Islam. The caliphate as a state and as a political unit is essentially destroyed.